So, Tobias Ahlin is a designer, developer, and lecturer hailing from Gothenburg, Sweden. He's currently a principal design engineer at GitHub, working from a small co-working space in Stockholm's Old Town. Before joining GitHub, Tobias held the position of Experience Design Director for Minecraft, and before that, he was working at Spotify. So please welcome Tobias.
Amazing. Thank you, Andreas. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be talking about something that's close to my heart, which is how we stand up for the unmeasurable in a data-driven design process. And I love measuring, I love statistics, but I often feel like when we embed ourselves in an overly design-driven or data-driven design process, we can lose out on a lot of things that we hold dear to our heart. And in that process, like, rather than assuming things, we measure, which is great because we can know what works and what doesn't. And it's not just about who has the best position to have a sort of make a case for something. But I think Albert Einstein or so says a quote that is often attributed to him, puts it well: not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. There's a lot of things that as soon as we try to measure them, fall out of what we generally think is important. Now, data can make us see more clearly, but I often feel like being embedded in a data-driven design process is like trying to see a painting while being sort of 1 centimeter away from the painting, right? And that can feel like seeing every single detail, every single color, but you possibly miss the bigger picture. And in this day and age where we have dogmas, sort of, where we're supposed to follow working smart, like specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-related, and we use OKRs and A/B tests, survival of the fittest, I think, has turned into survival of the measurable. And there's quite a few studies, actually, on how the act of measuring can cause unintended consequences, not necessarily within our industry, but in a few others. There's, for example, a study from Stockholm where managing ambulances with measurable outcomes caused higher mortality rates, or at least was highly correlated with them. This is a study from Harvard's Quarterly Journal of Economics. And what ended up happening in Stockholm was that there was an accidental pseudo-randomized study where the dispatch service assigned ambulances to patients without the concern of overship status. And we had a public manager of ambulances. And then we had a private manager of ambulances, right? So we ended up then allocating sort of randomly who were supposed to go to a specific case. And they saw that the risk of dying within 3 years after interacting with an ambulance was 1.4% higher with a private firm compared to a public firm. Here's how sort of they framed that result. While private ambulances are more efficient on quality outcomes that are contracted, their patients have higher mortality. These results are consistent with the private firms investing in quality that is contracted, but shirking on quality that is not contracted. It's in everything we can't really measure as soon as we try. Equally, or in a similar fashion, performance management in hospital has been linked to higher mortality rates. Here's a different study from Franco Santos, 2018. Here's how they put it: over-reliance of senior staff on the hospital's PMS, that is, performance management system, led to an organizational culture focused on doing the system's business, hitting performance targets, rather than doing the care maybe they are actually there for, resulting in patient neglect and higher mortality rates. Now, I think it's easy to, in this position, be like, well, we can just measure better. Maybe we can just target low mortality rates. And similarly, if we do that, that can lead to a lower acceptance of severe cases, because then maybe you're just trying to avoid having the severe cases to begin with. And in this sense, I feel like avoiding unintended consequences with performance management systems and being data-driven can sort of feel like trying to clutch water in your hands, and where the harder we grip, the more sort of water slips through our fingers. And if we do this, and if we lean on these kind of systems, we can hit all the targets but completely miss the point. That's not what brought us to design to begin with. So as we become more data-driven, I think we can lose touch with some of our core values. We aren't really measuring design when we're measuring design, right? We're measuring a behavior. And often that behavior is just clicks and taps. As soon as we have a digital interface, that's what we're actually measuring. And I think we have a responsibility to stand up for, in that process, what isn't actually measurable. At the same time, I think we have a responsibility as designers to measure better. For me, that means be the fiercest critic of data-driven design processes, yet at the same time insatiably curious about how we can measure and learn better. So here's a very specific common scenario that can happen at a company, right? So maybe you have an app that looks something like this. This is the core app that your users go to accomplish some sort of task, right? They are here and expecting an efficient interface. Then someone wants to maybe push for viewing something or looking at something or buying something that's not part of the core experience. And so they add a banner, maybe it looks something like this, and a huge button, and then they run a test. Maybe they have an hypothesis where they say something like, by featuring our offer at the top of the app, we will increase sales, which will increase revenue. So of course it's good for the company, right? Or so the thinking goes. If you do this, of course, and you measure sales as the success outcome, any increase in sales will prove the hypothesis right, which doesn't mean it's good for the end user, right? It just means that you're putting out an hypothesis that proves itself right. And a hypothesis that can only be proven right is not an hypothesis, it's a trap. It's the organization hitting itself in the back of its head. Maybe the hypothesis should look something like this. By featuring our offer at the top of the app, we will increase sales, which will increase revenue, which is good for the business unless retention decreases. Right? And it's hurting the core experience, so retention is going to be a factor. And I think a design that introduces friction will always risk bringing down vital key metrics that can hurt the bottom line. The tricky thing is that retention, which I think is a great metric to sort of capture quality, it can move slowly, right? Friction can build up over weeks and months and years, and then you're just fed up eventually. So the signal is probably going to be stronger if you look at the sales, and even if you measure retention, it might not budge down at all, which makes it difficult to argue for that this is the best type of experience, the experience without someone pushing to sell something at the top of your app. So I think retention is a great proxy for quality, but it can be difficult to detect meaningful changes if you just rely on that metric to catch your mistakes. That also often means that maybe we instead lean on other metrics, such as engagement, that are easier and cheaper to quantify. But I think that any targeted metric, especially not if you're doing anything other than retention, will eventually be gambled, manipulated, and diluted of its original value, and it's going to be difficult sort of guarding a good user experience by looking at engagement metrics. For example, A common scenario that we might not have lived through as a designer, but maybe as a user of some sorts, is that we use some sort of video app. We go to some service and we play a video and we think it's great. And someone at this company has a goal or a company goal to increase engagement. Often you can do that because it correlates with retention, so it makes sense to maybe target that as a value. And then someone comes up with the idea to just autoplay recommended clips when one clip ends, because that's going to bring up engagement, because engagement is measured in the amount of plays. The hypothesis could go something like this: by autoplaying new recommended clips when a clip has ended, we will bring up engagement. Now, again, this is a hypothesis that proves itself right because you're implementing the mechanic automatically that's going to prove the hypothesis right. An hypothesis that can only be proven right, it's not a hypothesis, it's a trap. So the result of this is probably going to be that engagement goes up because that's what you're automating, but engagement will correlate less strongly with retention following that because it's diluted of its value as a key metric. Eventually, with this type of aggressive engagement targeting change, you might be bringing retention down because it's annoying. But equally here, it can be difficult to argue for that manually playing a video is the better experience. And when we do, again, we can be hitting all the targets but completely missing the point in our organizations. So I think as we design things, as we get incentives and goals put on ourselves at company, or maybe we set them ourselves, we have the responsibility to ask why and at what cost. At what cost can we move this metric, and do we see any unintended consequences if we move it? And I think just having a gut feeling to always stand up for your core values can be profitable, because often, at least that's what I've experienced, is that a lot of designers, even if you can't argue for it, often think more long-term and think more about long-term metrics than the short-term metrics that can be targeted in a design process. For example, you can think that, oh, it's making the experience worse, which is going to affect retention, even if you don't talk about retention. And retention comes back to your core values. So I think to sort of be able to stand up for what isn't measurable in a data-driven design process, we need to measure better, which is problematic. But we need to lean into this process, and I think we need to guess better at the same time, too. Now, we can guess without measuring. And we can lean on some research on how we guess better, and we can turn our design process into not just building and testing to prove that things are better because it's tied to company goals or because it's tied to our incentives as a designer to get a promotion. But we can instead build and test to learn, to be curious, and to design something that is better. Now, when we guess with money, we usually use words like hypothesis, predictions, and business plans and analysis. Nevertheless, these are guesses. The issue is that we're notoriously bad at predicting the success and accuracy of ideas sort of at large. Any prediction is difficult. Like Lucas here, who, when asked what you're going to work with when you grow up, answers, frankly, when I grow up, I'm going to work with rocks. For example, I'm going to throw them in the water so it creates a massive splash. A cute guess, but albeit not very good. We also have another guess here. When I grow up, will 1, get a girlfriend, 2, kiss her, and 3, rule the world. Which at least is highly ambitious, which I think we should applaud. And I think we think that we get better at making predictions with time, that this is a problem for young people. But differentiating between causation and correlation in business is just so difficult. I think every single A/B test that I've been through, every single company that I've lived through, just proves to me constantly how I have no idea what I'm doing, even after working in this industry for I feel like far too long. And hindsight isn't then 20/20, but I think just full of preconceived ideas and biases. But if we look past our own experiences, I think that we have some good clues. And there are ways of behaving that have been proved or linked to producing better predictions, as in ways of behaving that we can adopt, which makes us guess better in our design processes. Now, one of the best sources of these sort of behavioral changes comes from a study that took over 20 years before they even started to publish results. It's still running. It's been running for 30 years now. It's called Good Judgment and Political Forecasting. It's been managed by Philip Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania for that entire time. And they found pretty early on in this study where they took hundreds of experts and they asked them to then, over 20 years in the beginning, predict the outcome of events within often their field of expertise. So if it were designers, they would only talk about design things, right? But this would be like economics and politics. And then they would say, for example, or ask them, will the Muslim Brotherhood win the election in Egypt by this date, yes or no? No nuances, nothing. Clear answers. You can't avoid sort of being right or wrong. And they found pretty early on that experts were incredibly bad at predicting the future, even worse than chance bad. They compared it to if a chimpanzee had just been there and thrown dart, and then you split the dart table in two and took one side rather than the other, that would have been on average better. However, what they found too was a causal relationship between having better judgment and certain personality traits. They did this by first, in their own study, finding a correlation between people who did exceedingly well in the study over a really long time. That's only correlation, right? So they saw that, said, well, that's a correlation, however they behave. They then had a qualitative study within their own study where they saw how they behaved. They then had an hypothesis for that if you teach others to behave in the same way, that will make them have better predictions. So that comes from a qualitative study within their own study. And then so they isolated different groups, taught them different ways of behaving, and then they managed to establish a causal relationship between adopting certain personality traits and having better guesses. Now, if we look at their core hypothesis, before maybe they thought they would have to do something with general intelligence or IQ, but within their own study, they saw no signal that that actually made a difference. They saw that people who made really bad guesses over time, they defined their behaviors as being dogmatic, right? And more specifically, they defined it as they were looking for facts to prove themselves right. They had strong opinions mixed with simple answers to difficult questions. And then they have one view of the world, and then they update the rules of proof to constantly fit that worldview. For example, if you're not believing in climate change and you say, well, the only thing that I would need to believe in climate change is to see this happen, and then that happens. And then they would be, oh, well, no, I mean, I would want to see that happen. And that, if you're dogmatic and you have a high IQ, means that you can defend your own ignorance with your intelligence. And that's their theory for why they didn't see a strong correlation between high IQ and making better guesses, because you can just trick yourself. Then you combine all of this with your just confidence in your ability to judge in any single instance. And if you do this and you just happen to misunderstand something to begin with, you can just get stuck in that mindset and not see sort of the right way to look at something. Now, the flip side is what they taught, right? And they try to teach people to have a nuanced mindset, an open mindset, and a curious mindset. The list of factors is just the complete opposite of what we just saw. So they taught people to look for facts to prove themselves wrong, to carefully weigh proofs for and against, to have complex answers to difficult questions, to update their views of the world after being exposed to new evidence, and confident in the difficulty of judging in any particular instance. Now, I think if we visualize these two ways of behaving, if we're dogmatic, we usually just have one idea, and then as time goes by, we still have the same idea and nothing happens, because we're more sort of concerned about protecting our ego and explaining why our idea works. If we instead adopt a nuanced mindset, what happens is that as soon as we're exposed to more data, our worldview grows more and more complex often. It can be more difficult to explain something that you know really well. Then you end up here, and when someone asks you for your opinion, you can be like, oh, that's complicated, I'm sorry, we're going to need an hour. And that's fine. And it's incredibly difficult to sort of stay sometimes in the mindset of letting things be complicated when you're pushed to perform, pushed to deliver on key results, and pushed to have an opinion. And they saw that a particular behavior that enabled people in this study to stay in this for longer was to say 3 words. They called this technique delayed judgment, and it basically about daring to say, I don't know. I don't know. Why? I don't know what this is happening. I don't know what the best solution is, but let's try. So that's a very concrete behavior, but this is the list of general abilities that they taught and that they proved that if you teach or learn, it can cause you to make better guesses. If we look at the design process from this point of view, I think our challenge can be often then to explore how to most effectively expose ourselves to evidence. Not evidence to prove that a metric is moving or not, but evidence in terms of trying to figure out what the best design is in a certain situation. So test not to prove, but to learn. If we take this idea to its extreme, sometimes you can actually acquire evidence faster by trying ideas that you know will fail, because you're trying not to improve anything, but to learn as much as possible. This is sometimes called testing for elasticity, and it's about trying to assess the impact of a problem area by introducing regressions within the problem areas before trying to make them better. To be concrete, Google has publicly talked about doing tests like this. Here's a blog post called Speed Matters. And I quote, "Our experiments demonstrate that by slowing down the search results page by 100 to 400 milliseconds, it has a measurable impact on the number of searches per user of -0.2 to -0.6, average over 4 or 6 weeks, depending on the experiment." As in, what they did was, they took their search experience, they took Google, they slowed it down artificially, they just added a delay. They did that in several groups, in several magnitudes, different ones, from -0.2 to from 100 to 400 milliseconds. And then they measured the outcome. What's going to happen to our users when the experience gets this much worse? What they know after that is how elastic is this metric, roughly, if we then try to make it better instead. So if they want to make, here for example, searches go up by 0.6, it's going to probably take them more than a speed improvement of 400 milliseconds. So they're testing the elasticity of the problem space before even investing in it. So they're trying an idea that they know will fail to learn as much as possible. You can similarly, for example, before building a feature, create a beta list sign up before the feature even has been built, to assess, in this instance, the interest in a feature that doesn't exist. And in the same way, trying to understand the elasticity of interest. But equally, you can do it within your own product by introducing regressions. You can equally just remove a feature entirely. See what happens if a user doesn't have this fancy feature. If we look at a creative process and the design process in this way of just like looking for clues constantly, I think a creative process leads us to new ideas by following the shape sort of the problem space. And our challenge is to understand what the problem space looks like. And not just how it's shaped, but how elastic it is, because that is going to form our ideas. There are beautiful sort of tangents to this phenomena in nature. For example, over 100,000 years ago, white-throated rails took off from Madagascar and they flew northwest, where they found a new home on a ring-shaped island in the Indian Ocean called Aldabra. Here, they evolved more robust bones, got heavier, and slowly lost their ability to fly. There were no natural predators, right? So that happened to be the most efficient path of evolution for them in that instance. So like penguins and dodos, through evolution, they became flightless. Now, due to rising sea levels, they sadly went extinct, but as sea levels went back down, around 10,000 years later, the bird reappeared. So the bird lives there now, but we see when we look that it has lived there before and then disappeared and reappeared. And what happened was that after the sea levels went down, white-throated rails took off from Madagascar, they found the same island, they evolved more robust bones, got heavier, and slowly lost the ability to fly. This is called iterative evolution, and it's about the same sort of idea of following the problem space in essentially the same way twice. As in, effective ideas are just waiting for us to discover them. We just need to map out the conceptual space and problem space as effectively as possible. That's, I think, what's exciting about measuring. Not necessarily hitting a specific target, right? But using it to learn. And it reminds me of, in this era, with machine learning becoming incredibly good at things, of how, for example, a machine learning model learns how to play Mario. Like, here's a perfect playthrough of Mario, not done by a human, but by a machine learning model called MAR-IO, where it only knows essentially one thing, and it's that's supposed to go to the right, because to the right, at some point, the goal. It's there waiting for the character. Then it has access to all the buttons it can push, and it has access to what happens on the screen. It doesn't know anything else. It can't reason. It doesn't know that it's really cute and has a great mustache. And then as it starts playing, these are all the buttons it can press. This is what happens in the beginning. It doesn't even know how to go right. Eventually, it figures out that if I press right, it's going to take me further towards the goal, which is at the right. But it has a very basic approach in the beginning, right? It doesn't do anything else other than pressing right. But do this not by having creative ideas, but rather than completely changing things at random and evaluating the problem space. Do it a few thousand times, and you pretty quickly can get a perfect playthrough of the map. That's how I try to look at measuring in a design process, right? We want to stay close to getting as many clues and as much data as possible throughout the process. But again, if we organize our companies to be driven by data, to just hit goals, we know that it can then cause unintended consequences. There's actually a study specifically on lean startups called Lean Startup and the Business Model, Experimentation Revisited, published 3 years ago, where in their words, their finding was this: lean startups heavy emphasis on readily observable feedback and immediately validating learning undersells the entrepreneurial scientist's central task of composing a novel theory and hypothesis, prompting instead a search for value and validation only where it is easy to observe it. As in, when we rely too heavily just on being driven by A/B tests, because that's sort of an industry dogma and we know it works, they say it inadvertently misspecifies the nature of hypothesis development and promotes incremental experiments that more often than not only generate incremental value. And for some businesses, that's great. That's exactly what you're looking for. For many businesses, as in most startups, you're not looking for incremental value. You're looking to innovate. You're looking to drive through ideas that are much more effective. And this reminds me sort of, when I looked through studies of what children reply to this question, I found this child who said, well, when I grow up, I'm 7, I want to be 8. Which is, I think, sort of the mindset that we can end up adopting if our performance metrics are then tied to just safely moving things with A/B tests. So being overly data-driven can create incentives to play it safe, or at least that's what they found in this study. For me, this is a long problem definition without much of a solution, I think, but sometimes, I think, it needs to start not with what we do within a company, but sometimes it means that we need to lean on goals that just aren't measurable. The discussion needs to start there. If your only OKR or way of setting goals is OKRs and defining things to be measurable, the problem lies there. It's not problematic to have OKRs, I think, but to too heavily lean on them and forget about other things is a problem. So sometimes it means that we should measure less. Sometimes I think it means, though, that we should just measure better and be curious and try to remember what brought us into design to begin with, which for me at least wasn't to hit performance metrics, but to make the experience better. And then the discussion needs to start with, can we measure if that's true? Can we make it better, and is it going to produce a meaningful, measurable outcome? And if not, then maybe we need to set a goal where that isn't the goal. And if we dare to have that discussion, and if we dare to lean on ways of behaving rather than only hitting key metrics, I think we can at least, to a part, stand up for the measurable in a data-driven design process. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. We've got a few questions. Actually, there's one, but I think I can ask everyone to try to come up with a few more, because this is worth discussing, but I'm going to ask this first. Okay. But what to tell marketing if they want a banner within the app? Oh, it refreshed, so we have a lot of questions.
Let's do the first one. What do you tell marketing if they want to put a banner within the app? Well, I think they probably have very clear goals that are tied to exactly what they're doing. So I think the discussion shouldn't be with marketing, but about their incentives, which means that you need to elevate the discussion to whoever is setting the incentives for the marketing org. To say or acknowledge that, yes, we need to be aware of that it can have unintended consequences, and they need to have that with themselves in that process. But I think you need to have that discussion at a different level, because they are just doing their job, which is fair.
So elevate the level of abstraction, take it from a different perspective.
Yeah, and whoever sets their goals needs to be aware of that, which can be difficult, but I think that's where the discussion needs to happen.
This is the, I want to talk to your manager
sort of deal. Yeah, but do smoothly, and don't blame me if it doesn't go well.
Okay. How reliable is elasticity? What if the negative and positive changes have a non-symmetrical effect?
I think they sort of never have a symmetrical effect. So I think it's a great question. But often what you can do, at least if you're targeting performance, like Google did, and you introduced a delay, you're going to see diminishing returns as you make it better. So what you know is the maximum outcome of making it better is what you found out when making it worse. But it's probably going to be less. But you know roughly, right? But so it's non-symmetrical in that it's always diminishing returns, but at least you know sort of where in the ballpark. And then as you do that a couple of times for different metrics, I think you're going to learn the measure of the curve and go from there. But you'll see diminishing returns.
Can you give examples of unmeasurable things?
Yeah. How does how happy does something make you? How much do you love it? How, like, we often talk about minimum lovable products or like making something high quality. We don't measure those things specifically. We measure the behavior around the experience. And so I think many of the things that we target, like make it more polished, make it more lovely, we don't capture those values. We capture the behavior, which is a proxy for those values.
Another one. How can you explain this to executive leadership within an organization?
Say exactly what I said, and hope that it worked. No, I don't know. It's incredibly, I think, difficult and on a case-by-case basis. I think that like having the discussion is the first step. And just pointing it out, I think, and especially maybe if you can find an instance that's effective, where like you can see that something changed in retention internally and prove that with your own data, that can be maybe more effective. But I think just having the conversation is a good start.
What are some clues or indicators that you can follow to know you're on the right track to innovate?
Who knows if you're on the right track? No, seriously. If you look at the or the graph where all these different ideas come up, right? I remember when I was at Spotify, we wanted to launch a feature, and it was about changing sort of how you navigate the app, like the core experience and navigation. And that was just like so many A/B tests. And they definitely took different turns. So it was, we never knew if we were actually on the right track, but we ran a test after a test after a test after a test for maybe almost a year, like it took months. And I think part of the process is being fine with not knowing and not singling in on one track and being like, oh, we're on the right track, but like constantly trying to push your explorations to be diverge to make sure that you don't miss out on the right track.
So it was spiraling off into different experience.
Yeah, exactly. Like rather than being like, oh, we measured once and then this is the path we took, it was like we measured 10 times. These are the paths that we explored. This is the one that ended up being the right track. We didn't know it was the right track, but we explored widely.
Oh, we have a lot coming in. So the next one is, what do you think about the traditional happiness metrics such as CSAT?
I think, well, I'm more familiar with NPS. I haven't used CSAT, but if you do anything where you ask people how happy they are, like Net Promoter Score, where I ask them to rate the experience, it's also not measuring actually how happy they are. It's measuring how happy they say they are. And so I think the most reliable way is to measure a behavior and not what someone thinks. But you should just be aware that that behavior is in turn not measuring maybe what you're actually out to improve or change. So generally, I think it's much better to target behavior, but be humble enough to acknowledge that that's not maybe the thing you think you're measuring, as in quality.
Thanks. Oh, this one's smart. How would you interpolate elasticity results to be representative?
I'm not 100% sure what they're asking for, honestly. I think it goes back to the original question of like, how does the curve look like? In the beginning, when you're doing these tests, you're not gonna know, and you'll have to figure it out. The one thing that you do know is, I think, that as soon as you try to make something better, you're gonna see diminishing returns. So you can always assume a weaker link from whatever you're doing from a stronger link. But I think to do that, you'll have to work with proper statisticians, not a designer like me, who know their shit, and then learn by doing. But that's the thing you know, is you're gonna see diminishing returns.
What was your biggest prior knowledge that you had to change because you realized it didn't work in reality?
I think we ran some tests at Spotify where it was so clear to me that it became prettier. The design is like, oh, it's so much cleaner. It's so nice. We removed a bunch of labels and metadata that were like duplicated pieces of metadata. Didn't make any sense. We made the imagery bigger. Zero effect. Nothing. Nothing came out of it. And running many kinds of those tests. Also, we had a new design manager who came from Netflix that brought with her some tests that they had run, where she would poll us on, like, here's A, here's B, which one did you think performed better? And as designers, our intuition was just like constantly off. We didn't know at all what would perform good and not. And so just going through tests and having to guess on others' tests made me at least question like the value of something like minimalistic or clean, which is more like an approach to design than something good. But we just assume that it's good because it's a core value for a lot of designers. But it's just a way of designing. If you're doing Snapchat, you don't want to make the interface clean or minimalistic. You want to make it fun and engaging, and then you don't lean on that as a strategy. And so going through that, I think, at least made me question, like, when does this core belief work and what's it useful for? And clearly, I don't know what's useful for Spotify users.
Interesting. How can you decide that if something is unmeasurable or difficult to measure, do you have any best practices?
Difficult. It's one of my, well, an anecdote that I think speaks to the difficulty of exactly this question. There's, I'm not sure if you know, but there's a discussion in some sports that people can have like a hot hand. Like you come into flow and then like suddenly you score a ton of points. And it was popular to, a few years ago, state that that's not a thing. Because a study was published where they looked at a ton of sports, they looked at people who had a hot hand and figured out that their likelihood of actually making a goal or scoring a point was not higher. So they deemed that, like, since we can't find it, it's not true. Then someone produced a data set, fake data set, where they introduced a hot hand. They knew it existed. They ran the original algorithm from the research paper on that example, and they proved that the original study just failed to find the pattern and then deemed it not existing rather than actually, first trying their own hypothesis on a data set. To say, I agree sort of with a core idea of that question, which is just because we can't find something doesn't mean it's not there, and we can't really know if it's difficult to measure or unmeasurable. And I have no answer to the question to actually make that better.
It's quite a hard one, so
yeah,
we'll give you a pass this time.
Thank you.
If you cannot measure it, how do you know that you can change that your change had a positive impact? Since you cannot correlate it to anything.
Yeah, this one. What you can do, if that's the case, is if you make sort of an equation where you have the original experience on one side, and then you have the new experience on one side. So you have like original, and then your test. And then you introduce a bunch of changes, and you see no change, because you can't measure it. How do you know it's better? Well, if you assign some sort of value to your intuition as an expert within this field, as a designer or as a product manager or whatever, if it has more than 0 value, and you're comparing 0 versus 0 plus intuition, intuition wins. As to say, I think it's fair that if you're running a test, you see no significant change at all to your core metrics, but you think it's better, just launch it, because it probably is better. Because your experience and expertise has some value.
So trust your gut is the message here?
Yeah, if you see 0 effect, you see 0 downside, 0 upside, just go with your gut. Absolutely.
Everyone wants to know your opinion about the new Spotify on Slack designs.
Oh, dear. I have a lot of friends who work there. No, I think in many ways they're great. They're daring to do different things. We should applaud them for that. I have one specific nitpick with the Spotify design, which is in the sidebar, they introduced an arrow to the right to like expand the sidebar on desktop, which is, to me, is just so unconventional that I struggle to understand the value you could see out of doing something like that, because it also confuses that, or I confuse that arrow with just like going back and forth, and Spotify is a browser. It's constructed like a browser where you jump around. So I think that pattern should be reconsidered. Other than that, I think they're doing great.
Thank you. And let's take this last one, because I think it will be useful. Can you please recommend some literature, courses, or learning opportunities for junior UX researchers?
Yeah, there's a really good book on measuring and being data-driven versus data-informed, published by, I think, O'Reilly. And it's written by Rochelle King, who was the sort of head of design at Spotify, before that at Netflix, and now she's back at Netflix. And I think it's a really good book on looking at sort of the entire design process from sort of the perspective of what's like the right type of research, when do we do quant, when do we do qual. So I think that's a great primer. Other than that, I would take a step back from our industry too and just look at statistic at large. There's a book too from A Book Apart, which is called How Much Data is Enough Data, I think, which is also really good.
Is it from the team, the Design Apart?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the same team.
Yeah, let's do the last one. What's your research tech toolkit, so tech stack?
It really depends on the company. So I don't have a great answer. At GitHub, where I'm now, we're leaning on a lot of Microsoft resources, many of which are internal. And they sort of switch vendor to vendor. Spotify has also just built their own to a very large degree to conduct research. However, Spotify has actually opened up some of the research sort of tools as a service just a few months ago. I don't remember the name, but you can Google it. And it's, I think, incredibly thought through. They guide you through running tests, how to do it, when the strongest single is, formulating your hypothesis, sort of the entire thing. You can pay for that as a service. So I liked it when I used it. I don't use it now.
Great. Is there any last question that you want to ask and that you didn't post on Slido, maybe by raising your hand? No? Okay. Well, Tobias, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This is a small gift from the team.
Beautiful.
And also together with an illustration.
Oh, that's very cute. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.